Welcome to Frank and Upfront. I am your host, Mr. Franklin. A very special welcome to all of you who are joining me here on this podcast. I invite you to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Today's topic: the true origins of black people. Often in this country, we black people are the scapegoat of racial discrimination from other ethnicities, but especially at the hands of the whites in this country. Often, their comments and remarks are so derogatory that it affects the psychic and the self-esteem of its intended target, especially those who are younger, those who are struggling to find themselves. Words are power. What you tell someone could reshape their perception of reality, of themselves, and of their identity. One should be careful of the words they use and how they say it, as you never know who you're impacting. The person you sabotage today could well be the person who will be pushing your wheelchair and changing your diapers tomorrow. And if that person has a long memory, as they should, they might just push your wheelchair off a cliff as well. They should. Anyhow, but quite often, one of the remarks that they use to degrade black people is to tell us to go back to Africa. How are you going to tell us to go back to Africa and we were here first on this continent? Matter of fact, we were here first. Across the globe, basically, across the entire free globe, as this picture before you now on your screen would suggest. Did we really come from Africa? Did we really? Or did we come from somewhere else? The short answer is that yes, we did come from Africa. We did come from there. But where they lied was when they said that they brought us over here on boats from Africa. No, they didn't. Or if they did, it was not in the massive droves as their history books would suggest. Our journey from Africa into the Americas is prehistoric and began 100 years ago, as the picture on your screen would suggest. Life began in Equatorial Guinea, or what is today known as Equatorial Guinea. What was then known as Equatorial Africa. Early humans, much as how we're curious, were also curious of the world outside of everything they had known at the time. Their zest for adventure and intrigue would lead them to leave their local village, migration trails in groups and packs of hundreds or perhaps thousands of people, would begin further north of equatorial Africa into the hot Sahara Desert, where they braved many wild animals and hot temperatures and a lack of water. Many died along the way, but then they made it past Egypt, some settling along the way while others continued into the Arabian Peninsula, across the Arabian Desert, up into Eurasia, where some settled, and then others went their separate ways. Some went west into Western Europe, into Iberia, into the British Isles, into England, into Scandinavia, while others went east into China and Mongolia and Siberia. Once again they stopped, and they went their separate ways. There are those who went south into China and then into Southeast Asia, into Indonesia, where they would reunite. This is, of course, thousands of years in the future. By now it's perhaps around 60,000 years ago. Reunite with those who had separated, or the descendants of those who were separated in the Arabian Peninsula, and who went south into India, Sri Lanka, and Burma. Reunite with that trail. They would continue their migration into Australia from Southeast Asia across the archipelago of Indonesia. Meanwhile, those who went further north into Scandinavia crossed the Bering Strait into Alaska and into the Americas, where they would then populate all of North America, into Central America, into South America. The Caribbean was populated by those who had ventured out from the Florida Keys and also from Venezuela into the Lesser Antilles. By the time the migrant trails had arrived into the Americas, it was around 12 to 15,000 years ago. So it took them from 100,000 years to 12,000 years ago. That's roughly around, I would say, 88,000 years to populate the Earth and to arrive into the Americas. In the space of 88,000 years, the ones who ventured into West Africa, who we know are highly capable, the Moroccans and the Nigerians, it's very possible that they actually developed ships. And we know the Moroccans knew how to build ships and how to sail, because they taught the shipbuilding to the Spaniards, who used that shipbuilding capability to conquer the world, including the Moors, out of revenge for the Moors occupying the Iberian Peninsula in the Kingdom of Granada. So I believe that in the space of the 85,000 years for which the migrant trails continued on land to populate the Earth, the West Africans and the Moroccans had built ships and had sailed over into the Americas. And I believe that their trail took place up into what is today known as the UK, into Scandinavia, across to Greenland, then down the eastern seaboard of the United States, starting from Newfoundland, all the way down to the Florida Keys and into the Caribbean. So it is just about possible that when the indigenous Indians had arrived across the Bering Strait into the Americas, they were not alone. They found Africans living there who built ships and sailed across the Atlantic. Which means that we would in fact truly be there first. So when they arrived 12,000 years ago, they found us already living there from God knows how long. Maybe 50,000 years at least 50,000 years. We had our civilizations, we had a water system and all that, but we welcomed them, and we coexisted despite our differences. They had their tribes, we had ours. You had black Indians and brown Indians living in the Americas. Or not Indians. Indians is a wrong choice of words. The brown ones were the Indians. You had black indigenous people living in the Americas. And you had brown indigenous people living in the Americas as well. And I don't believe that they saw race as an issue. I believe that they coexisted, not in perfect peace and harmony. They did have their tribal wars. They fought over land and spirituality. But it was nothing as overwhelmingly psychopathic as the greedy Babylon system in which we are forced to live in 2020. It was nothing as overwhelming as this. It was the natural competition for land and resources and food that mankind was perhaps meant to endure. That's the way it was supposed to be. Survival of the fittest. And yes, there was slavery, but not the kind of chattel slavery for which one would lose their identity, their name, their language, their spirituality, all of that. It wasn't about any of that. You see, what would happen when the different tribes would capture slaves is the different tribes would go to war to compete over land and resources and spirituality. And when they capture the POWs, the prisoners of war, what would happen? The prisoners of war who got captured, probably because they were careless and allowed themselves to get captured, is that they would serve under a kind of an apprenticeship kind of system to work off their debt for a period between 5 and 7 years. They would have a place to stay, they would be fed, they understood the terms and conditions of their enslavement, and they counted down the days until the end of their, I guess they could say, their prison sentence, right? They did not lose their names, their identities, their language, or their spirituality, or their ancestry. They knew exactly who they were. They worked off their debt. And when they went back home, they were better and stronger and more capable for having gone through that. It was not the kind of chattel slavery that was imposed upon the melanated peoples of this earth by the Europeans, for which we have been stripped of our language. Nothing like that. So they were intertribal warfare, for which they were competing for resources, in which POWs were captured as slaves. And then also there were internal strife within tribes, in which if you catch a thief, you cut his hand off. If he steals again, you cut his other hand off. Or if a man commits adultery with your wife, he would then work for the husband of the wife whom he slept with to pay off his debt until he learned his lesson, or until his 5-year apprenticeship period would come to an end, at which point he could go back home. Things of that nature. And if he rapes again, they cut off his penis. Right? Those are the kind of things. Now, I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's amoral. It was a necessary evil. It was amoral. But still yet, it was nothing compared to the overwhelming kind of chattel slavery that our ancestors were forced to endure. I don't think money, insofar as we understand it, had existed in their society. I'm not even sure if they had gold and silver. I think probably not. But they would barter trade with items that they had. They were highly agricultural in their practices. So they would barter off mangoes for apples, or grapes for pineapples, and or cows for goats, sheep for deer. Their society was predominantly agriculturally based, and they practiced organic agriculture. So they didn't have to worry about GMO food and processed food. None of that rubbish that's causing everybody to get sick and die young. They didn't have to worry about any of that. They had the fresh air, no factory exhaust, no jet exhaust, fresh air, organic agro practices, barter trading for which there was no money and no need to get up and go to a job and bust your ass and make ends meet and spend time away from your family. None of that. The agricultural villages that they maintained were family based, so everybody was involved. The men would be the hunters. Men would be hunters, women would be gatherers. And despite them possibly not liking each other, men had to be forced, unlike in this world today where you find that people have the luxury of choosing not to network or communicate because everything is available at the damn grocery store. Back in those days, for the sake of your survival, you had better find a way to work things out, put aside whatever differences you may have, and work together as a team to either hunt or be hunted, because the woolly mammoth was also hungry, and he was looking for some nice barbecue human meats to consume, and you would be wise to make sure that he got hunted and not you. And it required a group effort. That required a group effort. So one didn't have the luxury of, oh, I don't have to talk to you. I could just stay in my apartment and Netflix all day and order food on Grubhub. Nobody had that luxury, man. It was eat or be eaten. You know what? The world was a better place for having that kind of system. We were healthier, we lived longer, and we were forced to communicate and to network, and for the sake of survival. And perhaps we should maybe go back to that. I don't know. We'll see. And when men were forced to network among themselves for the sake of their survival, they found that they had more in common than not in common. And for them surviving extraordinary odds together as a group, they found they merged, or they established, an unbreakable bond, and they became friends as a result. The women and children would stay at home and gather the grains and berries of the land in preparation for the dinner, for the meal. And they'd all sit around a bonfire and kind of break bread together and drink wine. As a community, people were forced by forces bigger and greater than themselves. They were forced to commune among themselves and break bread and have a community, an agriculture community. Children were raised to have morals, grown-ups led by example. There were no factories, so the air was clean. There were no schools or jobs. The parents would school the children. The community would school the children. Thus the term, it takes a village to raise a child. And the grown-ups' jobs were to hunt and gather, that the whole village could be fed. And if one man needed a house to be built, the whole village would come together and help him build the house. And when it's someone else's turn, that man who had his house built at first, he would join the community effort. Join that community effort to build that next man's house as well. So you see, the whole thing, everything from agriculture to services to village building, everything would be bartered off, for there was no money in their society. And they had a vibrant society, a healthy society. And there are still some tribes to this day who maintained distance from our world. We look at them like they're savages, but they look at us like we're savages. They don't have littering, they don't have crime and corruption, and they damn well don't have the coronavirus, I'll tell you that much. So, who's really uncivilized here? Us or them? You think about that for a moment. I will say no more. But there are tribes like that, and they're protected by the United Nations and treaties and all those things. They cannot be touched by modern man. And if we go near them, they will shoot us with their poisoned bow and arrow, and I can't blame them. Anyhow, we existed for another, let me see, from 12,000 years ago till about 500 years ago. That was, we existed for like more than 10,000 years. In not perfect peace and harmony, but in relative peace and harmony among ourselves. Black and brown tribes who didn't see race as an issue, and the brown tribes understood that they came from us. They evolved differently because they went up into the Scandinavian part of the world. I'm sorry, not Scandinavia, the Siberian part of the world, those who went east. And because this was during the Ice Age, so even further south of Siberia was cooler because of that Ice Age. The same Ice Age for which there was a land bridge across the Bering Strait for which they could enter into the Americas from Siberia. They understood that over the 50-odd thousand years, they evolved differently from black people, but they still knew that they had come from us. Even people in like Thailand to this day have that understanding, and they have mad respect for us, like what the thinking man Templar had said based on his trip to Thailand. A girl told him they have mad respect for us because they know they come from us, and they haven't forgotten that. And the ancient indigenous brown Indian tribes also knew that as well, and they had respect for us, so they didn't see race as an issue. They respected us for having come from us. But then about 500 years ago was the arrival of the Europeans into the Americas. And everywhere in the world they went, and they saw evidence that we were here first as black people. They damaged the nose and the lips on the statues in those places. The same thing happened in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. where they damaged the Olmec statues. The Olmec tribes were a black tribe in Mexico who coexisted with the Aztecs, coexisted with them in relative peace and harmony. Damaged the nose and the lips on those statues, destroy evidence that we were here first. The same thing happened in Australia and New Zealand and Tasmania. Damaged the lips and all the Afrocentric features on those statues to destroy evidence that we were here first. But what I think the most deadly kind of genocide that took place against indigenous or melanated people on this earth took place in the Americas under the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Spaniards and the Portuguese signed off on a treaty where the Portuguese would get Brazil and the Spaniards would get the rest of the Americas outside of Brazil, and the Portuguese would get the eastern world, the entire eastern world east of the Americas. Why the Spaniards wanted the Americas so badly is to carry out their acts of vengeance against all melanated peoples wherever in the world they could find us, for revenge for what the Moors did, which, as I said before, was to occupy a small kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula, the Kingdom of Granada. The Spaniards had their lineage mixed. They felt it was unjust, they felt it was against their will, and they wanted revenge, and they wanted to wipe black people off the face of this earth. So they set out on a rampage of total destruction, and they set out on a genocide and where they could not cause a physical genocide of our people, they caused a genocide in the mentality and the identity of our people. They intermixed and interbred with the indigenous Indians. Intermix is a nice choice of words, isn't it? They raped the indigenous Indians, and it was the men doing the raping, not the women. So therefore, regardless of the offspring's phenotype, if the offspring was born with Aztec phenotype, he would still have a Spanish genotype, which means he would carry the ancestral burdens of the conquistadors from Spain. These offsprings would believe themselves to be white, and perhaps they are genotypically. They would be confused in their identity, separate from all things black from the black tribes with whom they had previously coexisted in relative peace and harmony. These are the descendants now, not the actual tribe themselves. The tribe experienced a genocide insofar as their identity was concerned. The original tribe, the offsprings were no longer Aztec or Inca or any of those indigenous tribes. They were now Spaniards. They spoke the language. They assumed the identity of the Spaniards. They even called themselves Hispanic and Latinos, even though it's a false, artificial construct. Many of them accept their blackness, others do not. They are the most confused ethnicity on the planet, because they're torn apart between those who embrace their Spanish conquistador lineage and others who want to embrace the indigenous black and brown lineages who were here first. Those who have taken on the spirituality of their white Spanish ancestors have separated themselves from all things black. They think they're different from us, even though they are mixed with black, and they were mixed with black prehistorically and before Columbus even arrived in the Americas. Now their whole entire spirituality has changed as such to want no part of us, and that was deliberate on the part of the Spanish conquistadors. They arrived in the Americas with the plan to confuse the indigenous peoples, or I should say the descendants of the indigenous peoples, that some would know exactly who they are and embrace it, and others would not. And those who embrace who they are historically would be shunned, would be excommunicated. There lies the confusion. They've broken up our community, our healthy, flourishing community, with their confusion as to our identity. So yes, a genocide did take place, but not physically, because everywhere I look around me, I see descendants of the Aztecs and the Incas. Everywhere I go, especially here in California. The genocide was not a physical death, it was a death of your identity and your spirituality. And yet every year in October, they celebrate Columbus Day. Columbus, who was a dunce and a rapist and a criminal, and who had syphilis and smallpox, and who was lost at sea. Our ancestors found Columbus lost at sea in the Bahamas, and he didn't know where he was. He thought he was in Southeast Asia. He thought he was in Indonesia, when he was really in the Caribbean. He didn't even know there was another continent, a whole other continent that separates the two sides of that one continent, which, by the way, as you can see, they tell you that Afro-Eurasia are 3 continents, but it's really one. It's really one, because where is the maritime border between Europe and Asia? And of course, Africa is joined to Eurasia by means of the Arabian Peninsula. So it's really one continent, as you can see. It's one continent, right? So Columbus was such a dunce, he didn't even do his research and realize that there's another whole entire continent between that separate the east and the west coast of Afro-Eurasia. But every year they celebrate this man's life with a holiday, and they teach the kids in school that he was a hero when he was really a conquistador and a rapist and a murderer. And why don't they teach the kids something more constructive in school, like who the real heroes are in our story? That would be a good idea. By the time the slave trade had begun, they were bringing people into the Americas, not just from Africa, but from all over the world. I believe the people who came from Africa were maybe like 5% of the people who they were bringing into the Americas from all over the world. In fact, I believe the slave story was told to us in reverse. There were so many of us over here in the Americas, they were bringing people over to other parts of the world, into Africa. They were dumping people into Africa to take us off the land so they could occupy the land for themselves. That was a part of their genocide and their agenda to divide and conquer. They relocated those who they could, and those who they couldn't, they found it easier to cause the genocide of their language, their identity, and their spirituality as well. Jamaica was often regarded as a place of punishment to send those who were rebellious. Those who were rebellious from other parts of the region and from other parts of the world in general would be warned that if they don't stay in line, they will be punished by being sent to this horrible prison colony called Jamaica, where they would be forced to chop sugarcane from sunrise till sunset in some giant fields, how many hundreds of acres of giant sugarcane fields, and some giant snakes this long, and people are very ophidiophobic, so that would be a deterrent. But for those who were so rebellious that no amount of threats would prevent them from fighting for their rights and their freedoms, they would be sent from all over the world, from Africa, from Southeast Asia and Australia and other parts of the Americas to Jamaica. So our motto truly means exactly what it sounds like. Out of many one people, we truly are an island of many people. We truly are descended from people from all over the world who were brought there to be penalized for their rebellion. And there were stories of some of the most rebellious of the lot, when they were being brought on ships to Jamaica from wherever they were coming from, they were so hot-blooded that they would start a mutiny on the ship. They would start a mutiny. They'd inspire others to rise up and rebel against the captain. They'd all overthrow the captain, throw him literally overboard into the sea to drown, capture the treasures that were stolen from wherever they stopped at to pick people up. All those treasures they would capture those treasures, and they would turn the ship around, head back to where they were coming from, and they would capture all of those treasures for themselves and sell the rest. Sometimes they make it back home, sometimes they would go somewhere else, wherever they want to go. The world was their oyster. They had fought for their freedom, and they had won their freedom, and they were now free to go wherever they wanted to go. That's the kind of people we were historically. That is exactly who we were historically. But today we're so docile, and we allow the government and everybody else to take advantage. And I know that it's the Christianity and the church and that preacher that made us so docile. How did we descend from people fighting for our freedoms, rebelling, being sent to Jamaica because we rebelled in the first place, overthrew the captain halfway to our destination, captured his treasures, turned the ship around, and went back home or wherever, and divided up the treasures and sold it for, and kept some for ourselves, and sold the rest to whomever was willing to buy. Right? And some of us even actually, some of the ones who did that probably decided that they were gonna just finish the voyage to Jamaica anyways. So some made it there, others turned the ship around and went back home. How did we descend from that to a bunch of people who have been made docile? It had to be the Christian church. I blame Christianity for a part of the genocide insofar as our identity and our spirituality is concerned. The Christian church had a huge role to play in that. A huge role to play. And in order for us to understand how we descended to be so docile and forgiving, and how anybody could offend us and do wrong to us, and all we could talk about in return is, oh, I forgive you. Jesus loves you, and I forgive you, and can I hug her? And Your Honor, can I hug her? I forgive you, and my brother would want me to forgive you too, and Jesus loves you, and I'm gonna give you this Bible right here, and 10 years is just gonna go off, and before you know it, you're gonna be a free woman. You know who I'm talking about. You know who said that. How the hell did we get from capturing the loot on the ship, turning the ship around and going back home, and all of that wonderful heroic thing that made me proud? How did we go from that to being so docile? It had to be the Christian church. It had to be Christianity. I will always and forever blame Christianity for taking part in the genocide of my people. And why are those stories of the insurrections on the ships, on the actual ships, why aren't those taught in school? Do you know why? Because that is the defeat. Those stories symbol defeat of the people telling the story. You see, in war, the victor will always tell the story. He will always control the narrative, and he will never mention the defeats that he did have along the way. Unless those defeats somehow made him stronger, he'll never tell you. So those are erased from our history books forever. Well, not forever, because we know that now. The people who, the oral history survived, which is why they don't want us, which is why they didn't want us speaking our indigenous languages, and which is why they even banned the local dialects on many of those islands in the Caribbean. They banned Jamaican dialect, banned Haitian dialect, because if they could ban any semblance of our native language, our indigenous language, they could always and forever control the narrative, and there wouldn't be any oral history, and there'd be a disconnect from the last person to have known the truth about our story and the first person who was told their narrative and their lies. But the oral history did survive regardless, despite their best efforts to disconnect the generations. But why are the kids being taught something in school to uplift them and make them feel proud of their ancestors? Instead, they're being told that this criminal and this rapist named Columbus is a hero. I could never understand that. Anyhow, the genocide of our identity led to the confusion of many of our people. Many don't know who they are. Many believe that they are somebody else, and maybe they are genotypically. We have been dominated genotypically and spiritually as well. Because your spirituality comes a great deal from your genotype, from the kind of DNA that you have. Your mentality and your spirituality, a great good chunk of that is not even learned behavior, it comes from you hereditarily from your ancestors. But if they understand, if the oral history was passed to them and they choose to neglect that, I'm talking about the modern day brown Indians now who they call Hispanics. If the oral history was passed down to you and the oral history survived, and you know about the other side of your lineage, and you choose to ignore it, and you choose to see black people as the competition and the enemy, And as such, you choose to be their enemies unprovoked because we don't see you that way. Our combined ancestors are not pleased. They are looking down at us. They're somewhere in the afterlife, looking down at us, fighting among ourselves, don't even realize that we're one people. And they are not pleased, they're not happy. They're not happy with us either, because we are too docile and we allow Christianity to make us so forgiving that we give away our rights much too easily. They're not pleased with us either. But they're not pleased with you either for so quickly giving away a half of your lineage to choose to align yourselves with the conquistadors in your story because you believe so strongly in Mehohala Raza that you would rather take on the spirituality and the mindset of your rapists and your conquerors and your murderers too. Because even if it wasn't a physical genocide, it was certainly a genocide of your identity, which is why you are referring to yourself not as Aztec or Inca, but instead as a Hispanic or a Latino, which those words come from Europe. The ancestors are not pleased with you. I am willing to do my part to end the cycle of abuse that have perpetuated itself in my community, to stand up more for our rights, to be less forgiving and more hostile to those who have shown us repeatedly that they do not like us or value us one iota, to stand up for our rights if no one else will, and to separate myself from any black person who doesn't see things my way and who is not willing to do their part as well to end the abuse and the discrimination and the disrespect against my people. They are a part of the problem. They're very comfortable. So I have no problem separating from those kind of black people and to align myself with those of us progressive black people who are on our way towards freeing ourselves really from the shackles of mental slavery so we can look towards a future where this Babylon system will not have such a stranglehold over our lives. You are more than free to do the same. It's up to you whether you want to heed advice or heed warning. But understand something here. The ancestors are not pleased, and the reset button had to be pushed, as you see happening around you today in this world. As you see happening currently in this world, the reset button on the story of creation had to be pushed. And with that said, this brings us to the end of Frank and Upfront for this week. Next week's topic will be the mark of the beast, and is the coronavirus the reset button? I hope you join me then. I am Mr. Franklin. This has been Frank and Upfront.